Record. Cool. All right, so that's quick claim deeds. So we talked about bargain and sale deed, special warranty deed, quick claim deed, and bargain and sale, or general warranty, special warranty, bargain and sale, quick claim. Questions on the deeds? Those are the ones we'll see the majority of the time. There are some other ones, and these are some special deeds when they're generally for one specific task, like a deed of release. So these deeds of release or a deed of satisfaction is a good thing. This is usually when you've paid off your mortgage. As we said earlier, we are going to put liens on record, right? So the race to record state, and we're going to record the lien against the property. Well, it's going to stay there until someone goes to the public record and takes it down. Well, the way they take that lien away is they file a deed of release or a deed of satisfaction that says this debt has been paid. We can assume that debt satisfied is no longer a lien against the property. So that's a good one. The surrender, which is an end of a life tenancy. So if we have a life tenant in place, we can file a deed to surrender the life tenancy. The gift, this is one where we might be gifting a property to a family member or a friend, and we can use a gift deed. The timber and mineral rights, we talked about those. So if we're going to sever those rights, there would be a deed on record that says the mineral oil and gas rights are now deeded to this person, or the timber rights are deeded to this person, and you can do that as well. So what happens if the grantee's name is omitted from the deed? Who is the grantee again? The person buying. So if the person buying or receiving the property is not on the deed, what does that do? Yeah, pretty much. It means it's not a valid deed. It's void. This is not a real deed, so it's useless. That's one of the essential elements that it has to have. What happens if the grantor dies before the transfer has taken place? Can we make that happen? Who's the grantor first and foremost?
The person
selling.
The giver, the person typically selling the property. If they die before the transfer takes place, can we still make that happen?
Yeah, if we pass it on to the heirs.
It can, yeah. So again, it can be given, and it can actually be, the biggest thing there is remember that receiving, right, has to be done while they're still alive. So the grantee has to voluntarily accept it and acknowledge it while the grantor is still alive.
So really that transaction would be null and void. They'd have to come up with a new one, decide who the heirs are, any blah blah.
Yeah, because once that deed is essentially invalid if it was not received while he's alive, so then it would go to his estate, whether hopefully he has a will or she, and so whomever it goes to in that will then would determine how they're going to deal with it. And they would potentially be able to go forward with the transfer to whom he saw fit, or they might keep it. They don't have to do it. Yeah.
What if it's like it's something that's will back to? It goes back to the state. Will the state still sell it to you, or at that point it's a whole other process?
So if it is two parts, so sometimes people will, believe it or not, they will leave things to the state on purpose. The biggest example I can think of this is sometimes people will leave things to their university, their alma mater, and so sometimes it's a state type of university and they'll leave it to them. The other part of that is if it escheats to the state, meaning there was no will, that means there's also no heirs, so there's no one to give it to. So the state essentially owns it and can sell it and will sell it for proceeds. So there's no one to give it to. There's no one to.
I was saying like the person who's in the plate they were about to buy it.
Oh, I see. Yeah, if they were about, they wouldn't have. It would be invalid still.
You have to go to the state and try to get it from them.
You got it. Yeah, it would have to go to the state because now at that point the state would take it.
Even if you're already under contract.
Now, contract's different. So we're just talking about the deeds. The contract's different.
Okay.
And that's a great question because his question is, what about the contract? We're just talking about deeds right now, but as we get to the contracts, if this deed said, or if this sentence said contract, not deed, contracts are passed to your estate. So yes, absolutely. And that's a different thing. We'll talk about that.
So the answer to the second one is it would be null and void.
Yeah, so can anyone sign on their behalf? And the answer is no. They have to be alive, they have to give it, and the receiver has to accept it while they're alive. So does a general warranty deed guarantee the deed is free of encumbrances? What's an encumbrance?
A burden on the title.
it's some burden on the title, right? So typically, let's just say it's a lien for this purpose. So can a general warranty deed guarantee that it's free of liens?
Warranty it, but not guarantee it.
Will it guarantee anything?
No.
No, it's not going to guarantee anything. And that's the reason that question is there, is to just watch your words. Because if you had just in your brain thought that that said maybe warrant instead of guarantee, you might have been okay with it. Guarantee is there. You will find in this class there are very few definitives or very few black and whites. There's a lot of it depends. There's very few what I call absolute answers where this is always the case or this is never the case. It seems like every rule I teach you has some exception. So very rarely will you see this is always the case. And is it going to guarantee something? Very rarely is there a guarantee for anything in this world. So upon death, we devise property, and that is with testate, and then without testate. So testate is with a will, intestate is without a will. And that references in when you're having leaving your will, it's in it's having a last will and testament. That's how I remember it. So having a last will and testament, so you either have testate or intestate. Types of wills. Let's talk about those. This holographic versus nuncupative. I can never say. I always want to say nincompoop. So I haven't seen these in your new material. So if you don't want to put a lot of emphasis on these, you don't have to. These are very little going to be just definition. A holographic just means it's a handwritten will. And a nincompoopive is it just means somebody witnessed it as an oral will. When it comes to wills, a written will always trump an oral. So even if there was on your deathbed, your nurse said that you left it to, you're leaving your entire estate to your nephew Sam, but your will says something different, they're going to go with the written will every time. So how is property dispersed after death? Well, you may end up with an executor or an executrix. These are the persons appointed in your estate to be the, as we referenced earlier, executor, who's in charge of it. If it is a female, it is an executrix. Hooked on phonics, works for me, I promise. In the court system, the court would have to appoint someone to be in charge of this estate. And if the court does it, it's an administrator if it is a male, or an administratrix if it is a female.
If you're gonna do that with this, why don't they do tricks with all the other ones too? I mean, it's a good thing they don't, because it'd be kind of wordy.
Yeah, it's. I think it could be it could go some really deep rabbit holes. So these are the only two that I know of that have the male and female versions. One is just appointed by the court, and one is just done in the will. What if a licensee is asked to list a property that is part of an estate? This is kind of where we went a little earlier. What's the first thing you need to do if you're going to list a property for sale that is, in fact, an estate? What's the very first thing you want to do? Check the public record for what? What am I looking for?
Any encumbrances?
Maybe encumbrances. I want to know who owns this property. Who owns this property? Because is it Uncle Sam that thinks that his uncle on his death, or the nephew Sam, that the uncle gave it to him on his deathbed because he said he could? Or is it the twice removed cousin that actually is the only living heir that would be receiving it? Or is it the scorned ex-wife who never actually got divorced and actually still owns it as tenants in the entirety? We don't know. If there's an estate, likely we need to talk to an attorney to figure out who has ownership interests. Now, if we're lucky, this is being handled in a very nice, clean, concise fashion. There was a written will. It says my son and daughter are now my estate who own the property. And the eldest son or eldest daughter is the executor of the estate, and they can decide. And they have the power to sell real estate on behalf of the estate. Yay.
That's like 18% of the time.
Yeah, that's very rare. It's very rare. But first, we got to figure out who our client is. Because if you get really excited and you're going, oh, I'm going to go sell this $1.3 million estate. I'm so excited, and I got Joe's signature, and you just rock and roll, and that's great. But really, it was James' property the whole time. Not only do you not get paid, you got excited for nothing, and you wasted a lot of your time, and you might be liable. Yeah, you might be liable at some point. So the first thing we need to do is go to the public record and find out what documents are available. Anybody know what probate is? Ever heard that word? What is it? What do we do with a probate?
It's when somebody dies in the will, somebody comes in and they test the water, so to say. They make sure everything's, all the i's are dotted and all the t's are crossed, and you are who you say you are, and
The
it's left to
oversight.
who.
Yeah, it's
It's
Or
real.
That a deceased person really got.
that's right. Yeah, it's triggered when someone passes, and it's a process. And I think that's probably the easiest way to say it is it's a process. And part of that process is making sure that the now rightful owners will take title and deed as such, that any outstanding debts from the deceased person are being settled. Typically that means we have to advertise the property and advertise the death in the local, some kind of local publication for a period of time. Always recommend that an attorney help someone do this. They do not have to. You can do probate and handle all the process by yourself. I am yet to meet someone who is not an attorney who has done it correctly. Because I'm like, have you gone through probate? And they're like, yes. And then we get there and then they haven't, or they missed a step. And now we've got a contract and we have a delay because we haven't completed probate correctly.
Creditor claims.
Creditor claims.
That's the biggest one
Yeah.
we see misses.
Yeah, because that's part of the probate process is someone is owed money from the proceeds of this property. And it was never properly advertised. And during that advertisement period, they should come lay claim to it. If they don't, then they may lose their interest in it. But if it wasn't properly advertised, they could show up later. So that probate process is pretty important. I say all this to tell you, anytime there's a complicated situation with who owns the property, our first step is probably to defer to an attorney to help us. We are not attorneys. Remember, I told you early and often, we will never be the one making the decision. We are not going to be the one to say, oh yeah, you did probate right. Oh yes, you're executor to the estate. We will defer, say, we were going to have to go to an attorney anyway. We close our properties at attorneys here in North Carolina. Let's just go to the closing attorney and make sure everything's on the up and up before we get the ball started. This saves everyone a lot of time. The other part of that is in regards to a trustee. Very similar to an estate, a trust is a way actually to avoid probate. It's great because then it's never transferring from one person to another. It's in the trust that lives beyond both persons. So again, I'm not going to be the person to tell. I'm not going to tell them about that. I'm going to say, talk to your attorney. Talk to your estate planning professionals. These are the persons to talk to. I just need to make sure my paperwork's right, and that we can transfer this. So lien foreclosures. If we have a lien foreclosure, this is typically the bank foreclosing on the property because you did not pay your mortgage. So we've talked about foreclosure a couple times, right? There are a few different flavors or types of foreclosure, believe it or not. There is the lien foreclosure, which is you have not paid a lien that you are that's against the property. You owe a debt, you haven't paid it. They have the right to take it as a part of the foreclosure. It's conducted without the consent of the property owner, making it an involuntary transfer through the courts under the power of sale clause in a deed of trust. Now I want to pause right there. Deed of trust. How many of you are scratching your head on that one? Well, you should be, because it's way more complicated than it sounds. Maybe not. Maybe you read ahead. So there are two types, or two typical practices of mortgage lending and kind of establishing this lien. Usually it's, or traditionally, it was the bank would give you money for a note, and life was good. Two-party instrument, really simple. You didn't pay the note, the bank took your house. But in order to do that, they would often have to go through the courts to sue you for defaulting on the note. Very complicated, takes a little while. Have to go sue them, take them to court, win the judgment, take possession, the sheriff's deed, blah, 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 right? So we now have this deed of trust in many states, which we'll talk about. And so, same process. You want money, right? So you go to the bank to get it. Bank says, I'll give you money, but we are both going to enter into this deed of trust. The deed of trust, simply put, is a permission slip that says if you do not pay, you do not stay. You are giving permission for the bank to foreclose and sell the property. They don't have to go to court. Here they have to go to court. Here you're signing a permission slip in advance. How many of you knew that when you got a mortgage? You're like, oh, more paperwork. We go to closing, sign. Where's my keys? Where's my keys? So we had this deed of trust, and a lot of states are going to this deed of trust because it's simpler. There's no court process required. You basically gave voluntary permission to come foreclose on my property as a lien foreclosure. Even though
There's still notice requirements.
Sure, there's a lot of requirements actually. There's notice requirements, it's still a process, right? It's still a process. It's just quicker, and it doesn't have to involve the court system, which many of the states in the recession that got hit really hard that have to go through courts were backed up for 8-9 months because they couldn't even get into court. You don't have to do that necessarily when you have the deed of trust. So adverse possession, what do we know about that? What's another word for it? Squatters' rights, right? So adverse possession always has a lot of questions, a lot of curiosity, because people think, I can get free house, I can get free real estate, this is fantastic. No, you really can't. Adverse possession has very specific rules, and it's designed for very specific circumstances. You don't just, it's not as beautiful as TV would make it look. So it is an involuntary transfer, meaning your property is being transferred to someone else, and you don't want it to be. So the adverse part of this means it is not friendly, right? So let's talk about what that looks like. There was actually a case, have been cases, scams, where people will, in fact, advertise your property for sale. And you will move into it, or you go to move into it and someone's already there. Real estate, by the way, is one of the highest retailed items on the planet. That's maybe the mattresses, because apparently there's a lot of those. So we sell a lot of houses, and because of that, our high price range, we get targeted for a lot of scams. We sell one of the biggest items on the planet, and you have to have 75 hours of class to do it. How many of you have ever gotten to being charged hundreds of thousands of dollars in assets by sitting through a class? You didn't have to do. No, what'd you have to do?
Well, before this, I ran national sales for Ram Certified Agriculture, which is
Oh.
a division of Business Link for Ram trucks.
Yep.
So it was more like hundreds of billions, but
Yeah, and what'd you have to do to do that?
it was everything from staff management to dealership.
No, what were your education requirements? What'd you have to do?
None.
None?
I mean, I sat through classes and I had to know the product and I had to know how to run everything, but as far as like actually getting the position, it was just
A job, right?
It was a job.
Yeah. Yeah, when you're in that position, it's a little different when someone's employing you. I would suspect whomever's writing those billions of dollars probably has some oversight. Probably SEC oversight.
oh yeah.
But there's a lot of governance that goes into these bigger transactions. Real estate's probably the top end of that list that has the least amount of governance and oversight. And so we are targeted a ton. Actually, I had a case last week where one of our buyers lost $18,000.
How?
Wire fraud.
Somebody intercepted, gave different instructions.
It was our buyer was going to purchase a property.
Yeah.
They needed $18,000 to close. The attorney said we need $18,000. They got an email with wiring instructions, and they followed the email instructions
Without verifying.
without verifying where they came from. They came from a fraudulent email. They wired $18,000 offshore, and it was gone.
So they hacked into their email, is that
The attorney's
the?
email.
Which
Wow.
email? Again, if I can get into your email, I can get into anything. You know what the #1 used password is on the planet?
Password.
Password. Still the #1 used password.
Some
And it-
dollar sign.
And all I have to do is reset your email, and I can get into your Netflix account, your Hulu account, your bank account. I can get anything I want, because what does everything do? Resets your passwords to your email.
But they'll get their money back, won't they, because they're insured.
No.
Why not?
Wire fraud is prevalent, and also a big part of our education as real estate brokers, because when it's wired off seas, there's no one to go after.
It's
Well,
not through the merchant
the
system.
insurance company.
If they had it. Many, wiring is like cash. It's like me getting $18,000 and dropping it off a bridge. It's just gone. It's hard to get back. Once it's gone, it's gone. And that was a small case. We had another one that almost lost $500,000. It was a $500,000 house that they owned, and the seller was expecting their proceeds, and the attorney got the email and said, hey, we've decided to put this in our savings account instead. Can you wire it to this account number? From their email. The hackers got into the buyer's email or the seller's email and watched the whole transaction, never said a word till the 11th hour. The attorney had the wherewithal to pick up the phone and call them and say, did you mean to tell me to put it in another account? And they said, nope. They were this close to wiring $500,000 offshores. And it's gone. That's why this education thing is pretty important.
Wow, it's really encouraging for the hackers too.
It is. That's why I said people don't come break in your house anymore. They can take your money and never even be in the country. And they have no extradition, and they're sitting in the Grand Caymans enjoying sunshine and roses.
I know we were sitting on the couch the other night, my husband and I, and we saw on the television, you know, when somebody calls, we had a phone call from me.
Oh wow. Yeah.
I was trying to answer it, but nobody would say anything.
I actually had somebody tried to steal my identity. This is a really fun one. So I had a call. Somebody called me and they're like, "Hey, Steven, I was calling to get paid for that work I've been doing." I'm sorry, who are you? I'm such and such here in Canada, and I've been working, and I've been doing all this administrative work. I've been working for like a month. I was hoping I'd get paid by now. I don't know who you are. She's like, "You're Steven Long, right?" Yeah. She's like, "Your email is stevenlong@gmail." I'm like, "Nope, it was taken." So someone got that email address, pretended to be me, employed this person to do virtual administrative work for them. And she looked it up, she Googled me and said, Steven Long, Keller Williams. She found me, called me. I'm like, sorry honey, I think somebody scammed you. And so, long story short, she went to the local Keller Williams office in Canada to ask and inquire. And of course they told her, sorry, there's not much we can do. They reported it to local officials, they investigated it. So that was the end of it, I thought, until I went to our convention, real estate convention about 2 years later. And it was in New Orleans, and we were at the mall along the river. And there was a Cafe Du Monde there where we were going to get some beignets. And somebody's like, Steven Long! I'm like, yeah? It was that lady. When she went to the Keller Williams to inquire about this situation, they hired her. She got a job there. And then we ran it. It was weird. Yeah, that did come. It was something good that came out of it. But our work, our business is just loaded with scams. Craigslist being one of the biggest ones.
And people keep falling for them, that's the issue.
They do. Yeah, it's amazing. There's a case we'll talk about one of your CE and post license class where there's a lady in Raleigh sitting in her house watching TV and people are knocking on her door saying, hey, I heard your house is for sale. Nope. Or I heard your house is for rent. I wired my security deposit. I'm looking for the key. They said it'd be under the mat. And they wired the money and it's gone. It's just gone.
Wow.
Yeah. So we've got to be real cautious. And things like this, and this is in regards to legal possession. Adverse possession is a legal possession. Those are just monetary hacks, scams. If I had moved into your property and tried to go through the proper procedures, I could potentially legally end up with the ownership of your property. So I own your property now.
But now part of it is like you have to like not notice or you have to like
There you go.
not be around. Yeah.
Perfect timing, perfect segue, because we have to have all of these things to make adverse possession work. So it has to be open, well known to others. It's not one of these things we're doing it in secret where we come and just use it at nighttime and then leave before everybody wakes up. Has to be continuous, meaning uninterrupted for the required period.
Is that 20 years?
Actually, we'll talk about that. It is typically 20 years. There is some instances where it could be 7 in North Carolina, and that's, we'll talk about that in the title. Exclusive, meaning you're the only one getting to use it, you're not sharing with anybody. Adverse to the true owner's possession, meaning not being the true owners. You are adverse, meaning you are not them. You are not given permission to use it by them, and you are not them. So you are adverse to the true owner's possession, and notorious, meaning you never had a permission slip from them to use it. So these are the absolute requirements to even have a case for adverse possession. They're kind of stringent, they're hard, with good reason. If I'm going to go to court and lay claim to real estate, that's not mine, I need to make sure that I've followed the rules to make sure no one's going to be upset about this.
I don't think you have this slide.
You don't.
Oh.
Thank you for asking. So I actually took, and she said, I don't think we have this slide. You may want to write this down. It's actually in the slide, I think previous or after, but I just expanded upon it. It's also in your textbook to give you a little bit further description on it. But I like to, every time I get to this section, I get more questions. So in this case, I did add a little more content. as I alluded to on the first day, the book that you have with your slides, there may be some edits in it as we go along, because I always tweak it in each class. Maybe I see something I like a little bit more, or something that's a little too much that you don't need anymore. So there'll always be a little tweak. So you may have to write a note or two. But this one I really like because it does take the time to break down what that OCEAN looks like, by the way. OCEAN is your acronym for this. And it shows up on your next slide. Here. Open, continuous, exclusive, adverse, and notorious. So in regards to your question, with this color of title, that requisite period of time can be cut down to 7 years. So what does that mean, this color of title? Does that mean my deed is printed in color instead of black and white?
Questionable ownership.
Yeah, questionable ownership. And this actually happens more often than you think, where my nephew, who I wanted to leave my property to, I gave him a deed, a valid deed with all the requirements. And the house was paid for free and clear. And on his 16th birthday, I said, here's the deed to your house. You can take it, it's yours now. He has a deed. Is it valid? Is it his property?
No.
Say yes.
Yeah,
It's his.
it's just done to public record.
Now, here's the thing. He's got the exact same deed with his name on it. Is his valid?
Yeah.
Yep. Whose property is it?
Is it was recorded?
What'd she say?
Who's that record?
Whoever records
First.
They're both valid deeds. They both own the property. But in North Carolina, the first to record owns it. So sometimes this color of title shows up because he thought he owned it. He had a deed. She had a deed. They both thought it was theirs. Wait a minute, we have some confusion. We may have to file an action or suit to quiet title. Meaning we're going to go to court to resolve this. Who actually owns it? And if I had that requisite color of title, meaning I have been using it for 7 years, because I've had this deed for 7 years, I've been living there for 7 years. You've been in South Florida. I've been here 7 years taking care of the property. Of course it's mine. Let's go to court with this suit to quiet title and let the courts decide. And with that potential color of title, meaning the belief and the real fortitude that it's mine, that 20 years could be shortened to 7 years. That make sense? So color of title is truly having a solid reason to believe that it was yours. And then tacking is enabling a party to use a previous time period. So tacking is sometimes saying, hey, I bought this property from Joe. We've been using it this way for 10 years. He's been using it this way for 10 years. So we can somehow tack that together to make the 20-year requisite if we need to. Also very hard to justify. It's not easy to take a property through adverse possession. But adverse possession exists essentially for property that's been abandoned. That's the intention. We do not want property not to be owned or claimed by somebody. And there's a case here in town that I knew of where it was a vacant commercial building downtown. And tenants moved in, started using the building, continued to use the building. Actually, they had color of title in the sense that they thought someone had given them permission to do so and had sold them this building. It was not a valid deed. But they did go claim it through adverse possession because they had what they thought was a valid deed. After 7 years, they went to court. No one showed up to challenge it because it had been abandoned. And so they did claim it through adverse possession.
Wow, how much is it worth now?
Probably not that much. Not that much. It was a dilapidated building, but most of downtown was at one point. And it's probably worth a lot more now. But at the time, it didn't seem like much because we had the recession with a lot of vacancy. So, questions on adverse possession? This is a really interesting topic for a lot of people, and you really want to ask a lot of questions, and I'm not one to stop you from asking a lot of questions. I do want you to know you don't have to know a ton about this, other than kind of what we've talked about, the OCEAN acronym, kind of what that looks like, color of title, and kind of really what it is at an understanding level with adverse possession. Questions so far? Feel good about that? I do. And there's color of title where typically you have an invalid deed. It's not really a valid deed. You have a reason to believe it's yours, but it wasn't. There's something that gives you the belief that it is yours. Prescriptive title is the rights to the property to possession, also called squatter's rights. We've talked about that. I've kind of synonymized that for you guys. So remember how I remember this. If you are squatting You probably need a prescription. So that's how you can remember prescriptive rights, prescriptive easement, squatter's rights, adverse possession. You always have to go to court to settle this, and it's through an action to quiet title, also maybe a suit to quiet title. That's the legal proceedings that you would go to in order to claim the property. Oh, by the way, government property is not subjective to adverse possession. Otherwise, the hobos of the world would own more real estate than all of us, because you cannot take government property through adverse possession. All right, how can I protect my clients with the public record? And this is where we start to talk about some real best practices with deeds and recording and things of that nature. So one thing that did happen with the adverse possession is a court case that happened. Actually, it happened here in Greensboro, not too far away. It was a case called Minton versus Minton, and it was a divorce situation. And the son and the wife were given some land to live on by the family. The son and wife lived on this land, built a house, lived there, cared for it. It was about 8 acres, and I think it was a 40-acre tract total. And the husband got divorced. He's like, peace out, I can't deal, he's gone. So the wife, kids stayed behind. They were meeting all the requirements for adverse possession. They thought it was theirs. It was not theirs directly. It was notorious. They had been asked to move. They just weren't. So over a period of time, they said, you know what? We're going to file a suit to quiet title. This is our place. We have been here. This is our home. And so it goes to court. And essentially their claim for the adverse possession was to try to take the whole 40 acres. The purpose of this court case was to essentially establish precedent that you can't. You can only take the portion that you're using. And in this case, they were awarded, I think, the adverse possession claim for the house in 8 acres because they said it had to have been that portion that you were using. You couldn't claim adverse possession for the rest of it that you were not using. So that was kind of the short version. But if you want to read the full court case, you can Google it. It's Minton versus Minton. And I think it has the reference in your book as well. So you can only get the portion in which you actually possess. Oh, there it is. Minor, not minor, sorry. I said Minton, it's minor, sorry. Minor.
I thought it was a different case, but I'm like, that looks
Nope.
really similar.
So I was going from memory on that. Minor versus minor. And that's the case. It was 23 acres, not 40. I was close. And that's essentially the end of it. Suit to quiet title or action to quiet title is again how we're going to release those. These can be filed for adverse possession in the event of a release of easement. So we have an easement dispute. Is it in existence? Do we need it to go away? We can do an action or suit to quiet the title for the easement. Foreclosures or bankruptcy to settle any ownership issues that may have come up through there. We can have a suit or action to quiet title. And also with judgments. So if we need to file those, we can, or settle those up, we can do the same action. Escheats we talked about. Escheat is when you die with no will and no heirs. You will then leave your property inadvertently to the state. Eminent domain is the policing power of the government to actually condemn a property for the greater good, and they will always have to pay you fair market value. You cannot prevent the property from being condemned. So let's see how you're doing. Does the owner need to have knowledge of adverse possession in order for a claim to be successful? The answer here is it kind of depends. They don't actually have to know, but they are expected to know. So one thing that kind of is in conjunction with this next question, what if they're disabled? There's no fair housing protection for this. They're assumed if you have 100 acres, you are expected to investigate and inspect your property. If someone is squatting on your property and claims through adverse possession and you didn't check it out and you weren't there to see it, they may very well have that claim. And there are places in this country you can still take property through adverse possession. I actually have a good realtor friend in Alaska. And Alaska, by the way, is like a small country. But there are many places you can go literally camp and after the requisite period, file a claim to that property as your own. The portion in which you're using, and you would get that snowy little ice ball. You want that. What is that covenant of cession again? What does that mean?
Down
Yeah,
Confirmation.
this is the covenant. Which particular deed was that one on?
General.
General warranty deed that says that I own it. I have the capacity to transfer this to you. So that's the covenant of cession. So how do I know who owns the property? Yeah, I need to look it up with the deed. What if it's questionable? Who do I need to talk to? Probably talk to an attorney and be like, help me out. I need you. And by the way, they may have to do a title search.
That's not what it costs.
He says it sounds like it costs. It might cost. It's not as much as you think. Usually for a couple $100s or less, you can figure out who is the owner and what liens exist. And believe it or not, I think that's something that will become a more an earlier part of our home and our real estate buying process than it is right now. Right now, title searches are usually towards the end. Like, we're about to close, let's do the title search and make sure everybody's paid off. Yeah, I think that'll become a little sooner, because what if we did something wrong? Let's learn about that sooner. What if we have a spouse that we don't know about? What if we have had many an issue where we've had closings where we are ready to close. We're like, hey, everybody's good. We've listed it. We've got a buyer. We got a seller. Let's go sign the paperwork. And on the way there, we're like, nope, can't close. We had one, I think I told you it was in Kernersville, where they had a judgment, right? And no one found this judgment, a personal judgment against the seller. Yep. And so then they couldn't buy, or they couldn't sell because they had to pay off that judgment. And wasn't enough money to pay off the judgment. We've had others where I actually was buying a personal property, and we'll talk about it more in the title section, but during the persons I was buying it from, it was an estate, which that was fine. The person signing the paperwork was fine. What had happened though is during the course of their ownership, the husband, so I think it was right, the husband passed, leaving the property then to the wife, right? Through tenants in the entirety. But they weren't tenants in the entirety. They had actually, they were tenants in common, speaking loosely. There was no documented evidence where he left his portion to her. So we have what we call a cloud on title. We had a deceased person who had an interest in the property with no document in the public record as to where'd that go. We assumed it was supposed to go to his wife. It was assumed it went to his wife, but we didn't have any documentation of it. So it was a cloud on title. It was years, many, many years ago, because this has been the same family. It's 20-some years old. So finding evidence was hard. So we had to work through it, and fortunately we were able to go back, and believe it or not, some of the stuff wasn't always online. We used to do this thing called microfiche. Anybody familiar with that?
Yeah.
It's like itty-bitty film, and you put it under a big magnifying glass, real fun. So we were able to go back in the microfiche records and find basically that deed where he transferred all his rights to his wife. So then we were able to reestablish the clear title. But this was on the way to closing, because we're usually not doing this but a few days out. So title search can be a big inspection that your buyers may want to do earlier rather than not. Now, as I mentioned earlier, what did the contract say? The seller has to do that. Provide clear title. So it's still on the seller, and that becomes relevant as we get into contract issues later. But it's still a delay. We're going to have a problem.
What's your percent of deals that are financed versus not? Because I mean, if you're financing and you got a mortgage, you're going to find it before you get close to closing.
Yeah,
With
so
the time frames and all now, but
his question is how many of them are actually having lending versus how many of them are cash deals. I'd probably say it's probably about 75. Yeah, so I'd say about 75% are mortgage, mostly because we're doing a lot of residential stuff. The commercial world's a lot different. Investment world's a lot different. A lot of investments, and even in the market previous to this, money's cheap right now. It just makes sense to get a loan. When you've got 3 and 4% interest rate, people will use that leverage. When interest rates are 18, 19%, it'll flip. You'll see more cash deals, probably.
do you find attorneys that are willing to just sort of flip them a few documents, take a look, see who owns it before you write up a contract if they're not the one that's going to guarantee to get closed?
Yeah, so I will offer to pay as their broker. Listen, I need to know. So I'll give you an example. I had a seller whom, when I listed their property, they said everything was looked good, and it did. Everything looked good on my end, but 6-8 weeks into the contract or into the listing, we had a contract. They were going on to buy something. Someone was buying their house. Somewhere in conversation, they mentioned something about a bankruptcy that they had had. Now the contract says, are any way under bankruptcy protection, any of this? They had answered no, so I had no way to know. But somehow it came up in conversation. I'm like, tell me a little more about that. And so I went to, and they're like, no, it's fine. We've got it handled. So I was like, I went to the closing attorney. I said, I know we're a few weeks out. I need you to do a title search on this property. And if it doesn't close, I'll pay for it. But I need to know that I have the ability to sell this thing and we're not going to have problems. He did. He found the bankruptcy. He found a problem. And then he found where it had been resolved. So they were correct in the sense that they had that bankruptcy. It had been basically discharged and taken care of within the requisite time periods. But they had me nervous for a minute. And so it was fine. And the title, it would have cost me $150.
Tell them the story when they say that.
What's that?
Most of the time, people aren't telling the truth when they say they took care of the bankruptcy.
Yeah.
You prove it for yourself.
Yeah, and there's so many rules and so many regulations that surround a bankruptcy. Again, like a trust or an estate, if it's not handled by an attorney, you think you've handled it, but you may not have. Always good to get legal advice on those and defer your clients to get that as well. Let's see. Ooh, yeah. So let's get into title. This is a good place to break. Let's break right here and then we'll come back and start talking title.